Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're very excited to have you here today. We are going to be talking about resilience for crisis line staff and teams. It'd be great if you, I think you might only be able to pick a single choice, so I apologize, but it'd be great to know who here is really doing crisis line work, so picking crisis line staff, or if you're a crisis line supervisor, what's your workplace settings, and how long have you been in your position? So it's really helpful to see who's in the room. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a few things. First and foremost, we really always want to talk about the land that we sit on and work on. And my name is Christina Clayton. I'm one of the co-directors of the Northwest MHTTC, and we are based in Seattle. And so we want to reflect on the land where we work and where we reside and acknowledge all the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. We are on unceded lands. We want to always commit to being better stewards and working for action and advocacy and support in these communities. So if you want to learn about your communities, you can see the chat around Native land. Thank you if you need to put things in the chat with who you are as well. So thank you. We also want to introduce Mentimeter. So if you haven't used Mentimeter before, we are going to have a couple of exercises to get some input from you. And so you will see this link in the chat. And this is something that we'll just show at the beginning and about midway through to get some of your input on some of these topics. So go ahead and you can log on to that anytime in your browser. A little bit about the MHTTC network. It's a nationwide network supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian Alaska Native Center. We have a National Hispanic and Latino Center and a network coordinating office. And there are similar networks for the addiction field and prevention field using the same structure. So we're all about resource development, disseminating training and technical assistance, and workforce development. And we are fortunate to be here in Region 10, including Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. But of course, it's virtual, so anyone can be on these events. Our Northwest MHTTC is based at the University of Washington, as I mentioned, and we're in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Our area of focus for the network is evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis, but we do training on a lot of different topics, and our goal is to really just keep the free training coming and do projects and events and resources that you can use. And so we do that through online courses, webinars such as this. We record these. We do virtual learning communities, newsletters, resource library, print media, and other kind of events. We also have a podcast. So if you'd like to hear more, we can put our information in the chat. You can sign up to get the events as you like. At the MHTTC network, we do want to always be mindful of using affirming and respectful and recovery-oriented language. So we all share this slide at our events to make sure that we know there are a lot of different perspectives out there that come up in these events, and we just want everyone to use language that's respectful and non-judgmental and inclusive of all cultures and experiences. Few logistics about the communication during the session. Since you're muted and off camera, it's being recorded. You can use closed captioning. We will share a video recording and the slides and how to obtain a certificate of attendance in a few weeks. There's no formal CEs, but often these can be used to get information for your licensure if you need that. Please use the chat for any technical issues, and we will be prompting you at least once to type in some comments when Dr. Mosseth is going over some of her presentation. So again, we want to use a way to feel like it's interactive, even though it is a webinar. When and if you have questions for Dr. Mosseth, please put those in the Q&A box, because I will be queuing those up and letting her know when there are questions, probably near the end of the presentation. Your input is really crucial to our work, and we look at all your feedback. It is anonymous, confidential. So if you can please fill out the evaluation, we will put it in before the top of the well, probably within an hour in case anybody has to leave early, but we want to make sure you can tell us how you felt like this went. So we really want to get your input. We share the aggregated results with our speakers and our training team, and it helps keep the free training coming. So we appreciate that. And as a disclaimer, You can read that. SAMHSA funds us, but they don't have particular opinions about any one of our content. All right. So again, if you want to get onto that Menti, we're going to be doing this in just a minute. And I think, Gabrielle, should we go ahead and do this part now? So I think I will stop screen sharing here. All right. And then our wonderful program manager, Gabrielle, is going to share a screen. Oh, wow. So some of you are already answering. That's fantastic. Yeah. So we just want to hear, we're obviously talking about some very challenging topics today, and what are the issues and what are the shortcomings and what are the, barriers to doing this effectively. But we really know that most all of us have come to this kind of work because of something that happened, something that drives us, something that is meaningful to us. And so really wanted to gather this information. So really lovely to see what is happening. No one comes here to this work to try and do a poor job with not enough resources. So I know for everyone, I really appreciate it. So you can keep typing that in, and then we will probably make something out of this and share that when we have the recording done. But at this point, I think I want to turn it over to our presenter. And today's presenter, I will share my screen one more time, is Dr. Kira Mosseth. And we're very excited to have her here. If you have followed our center in any way in the past couple of years, you've seen her a number of times because she is amazing. Practicing clinical psychologist who splits her professional time between seeing patients at Snohomish Psychology Associates, teaching as a senior instructor at Seattle University, serving as a co-lead for the behavioral health strike team for the Washington State Department of Health. She also serves on the state's Disaster Medical Advisory Committee. Her work and research interests focus on resilience and recovery from trauma, as well as disaster behavioral health. And she's worked abroad extensively in disaster response and with first responders and healthcare workers throughout the United States. She also conducts trainings and provides presentations such as this to organizations and educational groups about disaster preparedness and resilience building within local communities. We are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Mosseth here today, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my slides. It's nice to be here with you all this afternoon, at least in Washington, on the Pacific Northwest coast. Hoping you can see that okay. I'm just getting the Q&A and the chat and everything all set up on my end, and we'll go ahead and dive in. Okay, great. Thanks for joining today. Thanks for adding all of your info to the chat. That's really helpful for me to have an understanding of people's experience and what your work looks like a little bit. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the larger scale context for crisis responders and giving you some examples of sort of a snapshot for what's happening right now in the final bit of 2022 as we head into 2023. What are the current behavioral health sort of issues based on demographic categories? I'm going to talk about specific behavioral health risks and challenges when it comes to crisis responding during this large-scale recovery process. And I'm going to talk about strategies and evidence-based sort of practices and ideas and strategies around, recovery, good boundaries, the things that we know work that are effective in promoting resilience and behavioral health support for each other and ourselves. And then also I'm going to present the Thrive model, and we'll be pausing in the middle to do one more Mentimeter and then asking for some additional contribution in the chat in a minute. So thanks again for everybody for being here today. So I usually like to start with this because this gives us some of that context on a very, very high level. This is just a framework. This is not a model that everybody is designed to fit into perfectly. But this is a disaster model that reflects the process that humans tend to go through when we experience any kind of a large-scale disaster incident. It doesn't particularly matter what kind it was or is. This is a SAMHSA graph that was based on information from all types of disasters all over the world. So the earthquake in Haiti, the tsunami in Southeast Asia in 2006, the Fukushima nuclear meltdown in Japan, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, right? Lots of different large-scale events. So we go through these phases. It's not super specific, but the point here is that if human beings get the opportunity the vast majority of people are going to recover. They're going to get back to their personal level of behavioral health baseline in terms of coping skills and emotional resources in about 18 to 22 months after the impact of a disaster, right? And again, it doesn't really matter what kind. It could be a flood or a fire or any other kind of event. But that's clearly not as simple as what happened with COVID. So we started with the impact phase, which, depending on where you are geographically, the impact was at different points throughout the year in 2020. In Washington State, that was right at the beginning of March, kind of mid-March of 2020. And then all through the rest, the disillusionment phase tends to be the hardest part. As you can see from the chart here, that's when the behavioral health symptoms are the highest and we're feeling the worst emotionally. And that was over the winter months of 2020 into 2021. And then the final stage is usually literal in terms of reconstruction, buildings and houses and roads and things. In the context of the pandemic, it was social or is cultural, social, political, economic, lots of other kinds of things. So not quite as specific as this, but the framework I think is very appropriate to understand. This is a graph that I have updated for Washington specifically, but I would encourage you to sort of think about it based on where you're from as well. That what we have experienced and what we are recovering from, regardless of the specific type of crisis responding that you do, is what's called a disaster cascade. And disaster cascades are more complex and they're lasting longer than a single incident large-scale disaster. So you still start with the same phases, but then you have a secondary impact or then a third impact, or sometimes even a fourth or a fifth. Lots of smaller geographical locations have also experienced 4 or 5, which tend to restart this sort of disaster timeline in terms of these ups and downs, characterized really by, we got this, it'll be okay. And then, oh no, it's not. And it really doesn't feel good. And we're struggling a lot. And then, oh, we're starting to recover. And then, oh no. And it's sort of this roller coaster back and forth. And I think what's important to consider about this is that even though the emergency declarations around the pandemic have ended almost everywhere, the behavioral health impacts, particularly for youth, adolescents, and young adults, are not resolved. This is not something that just, wraps up nice and tidy. I know that all of you who do this type of work are well aware of the degree to which these populations are affected in the community, much more significantly than adults are right now. And the graph is only intended to represent that across the population, there are many different levels of experience when it comes to behavioral health impacts. I'm gonna start here by giving you a snapshot of what the current sort of the primary issues are by age group. So for young kids, many of you may be familiar with a study that was recently released. It was a large-scale study that was done. There was one in the United States as well as one in England, actually. And it shows some very concerning developmental delay in some cases, and regression is more common for young kids. These are babies that were born during the pandemic and may or may not have had the opportunity to socialize to the extent that they normally would. And we're seeing things like fine motor development and communication delay that are surprising. They're clinically significant. And they're surprising pediatricians for sure. So we got to keep an eye on that. And I think what the takeaway is here is that modeling and exposing young kids to social environments, to peer groups, getting them out and experiencing things in the world is really an integral part of their recovery collectively. For school-aged kids, so this is kindergarten through middle school, it's really around emotion and behavior regulation. It's about these kids who had a gap in terms of in-person learning in many cases that really disrupted their ability to see from a social perspective how to become a 5th grader or a 3rd grader, because they didn't get to have that social comparison and sort of that modeling that comes from peer interaction. There's a lot that online education was able to sort of rescue and save, but that social interaction that really is sort of this bedrock of a lot of behavioral interaction was missing in many cases. So there are certainly lots of academic challenges, lots of social difficulties, but I will argue this strongly. The academics will come. Like that is not, you can't learn a lot of new information when you're neurologically dysregulated in the way that many of these kids are. And so we need to prioritize, just like we prioritized not sending kids to school on an empty stomach and expecting them to learn, and really supporting school breakfasts and things. We need to support this neurological regulation in order to set this opportunity up for kids to be able to engage in academics. So that will come later, but we need to focus on this neurobiological recovery for them. For youth, high school age students, what we've seen, at least in Washington, and I haven't seen data from elsewhere in the United States, but I suspect it would be similar, is that the kids who are seeming to show up with the most acute behavioral health expressions are the kids that missed the in-person transition from elementary to middle school or from middle school to high school. And so what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. I talked with a colleague the other day, and they're working with a family whose son is now an 8th grader in middle school. And before the pandemic started, this was a 5th grader in elementary school. And now they're in person as an 8th grader, and they're really kind of at sea because they're not sure how to do it. I mean, elementary school is so far and away different from how middle school functions. There's so much more independence and autonomy. But if you didn't experience that stepwise sort of scaffolding effect in terms of your exposure to things, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And so those kids are struggling. They tend to be struggling a little bit more than others. Another thing, this is just an aside, but the sense of threat that teenagers experience is neurologically stronger than it is for adults. And most adults are walking around with activated limbic systems. We feel a little bit more threatened. That is absolutely the case for teenagers. It's always been slightly that way because the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until people are in their early 20s. And so kids have struggled with that ability to sort of self-regulate and consider consequences because of the development behind it. But what's happening now is that because they are so limbically active, this threat scanning has kind of taken over a lot. And so they're much more likely to respond aggressively and defensively and very, very impulsively than they might have otherwise done. For young adults, this particular population is the group that I work with in my role at Seattle University for the most part. There's a lot of concern that I'm hearing. I'm talking to students on a regular basis about the realistic long-term opportunities that they have. There's a sense of uncertainty, a sense of like, I can't get my feet underneath me because I don't know what's going to happen here. And then there's also this sense that I don't know how specific this is to this generation. I suspect that every generation has had the same thought, but it's around, we sort of have each other's back, but nobody else gets us. Like everybody else kind of thinks that we are a certain way, and we don't think we are. It's sort of the self-identity around in-group, out-group status, feeling rejected by other generations and not understood. For adults, 26 to 65, a lot of financial pressure. A lot of us, I'm putting myself in this category, are grieving the losses of relationships with people who are still alive. Some friendships have changed, some family member relationships have shifted. There's still ongoing brain fog, cognitive challenges, lack of memory and getting distracted by things, a general sense of disorganization. And then for older adults, a lack of social connection or being concerned with that, how to stay engaged, how to support friends who might be experiencing deteriorating health or health crisis. As people get older, that's a real big, it's a potential threat, but it's also a concern for folks. So that's just a snapshot in brief of the high level behavioral health issues of the day. These are the top things that we are sort of supporting and working with when it comes to behavioral health right now, at least in Washington State. But I suspect that a lot of those themes are reflected elsewhere. I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about neurophysiology. Most of you know all of this already, but it's important to understand from a personal lens how you can apply some of the things that you probably use at work on a regular basis and think about what it's doing for you internally. So apply some of that academic knowledge that you have and that you might use professionally and try to look inward a little bit. Our bodies are incredible at responding to challenges, at dealing with threats, managing through crisis and emergencies. And the whole design is around keep staying alive and staying safe and processing that potential threat. That is a really effective system if a bear comes out of the woods. Maybe that metaphor is only useful in certain geographic areas, but whatever the thing is, whatever the potential threat is, That's when our system is designed to activate the sympathetic nervous system, get everything flowing to get us out of there, fight, flight, or freeze, right? The problem is that, or one problem is that when it builds up over time, when that threat response builds up over time, it can have pretty incredible traumatic reactions. It can have long-term chronic large-scale stress effects that look in the brain and body in a very similar way. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what is the relationship between trauma and stress? And they are related to each other, right? All trauma is stressful. And here's a metaphor. If it works for you, then use it. If it does not work for you, pretend I didn't say anything. All trauma is stressful, meaning all ducks are birds, right? But not all stress is traumatic. So we all have stress, right? That doesn't mean we all have trauma. So there's a relationship between them, but they're not the same thing. What is the same is that chronic long-term stress can look a lot and manifest itself a lot like people's reaction to a traumatic incident. So even though the sources are different, one is stress built up over a long time and one is incident related, the outcome can be very, very similar in the long run. Stress is gradual or event-based. It can be either. Tragedy is usually event-based, and trauma is usually event-based, but can also build up over time, especially when you include some adverse childhood experiences. So PTSD specifically is often the diagnostic combination that's the result of a long-term buildup of stress or a specific incident that causes this stress reaction in people, and some combination of those things. So sort of a rhetorical question. I'm sorry that there's a little bit of a typo there. What are the key issues moving forward in our webinar today for people who work in a world that are surrounded by these conditions? This right here is the nature of crisis responding. There's no break from this. There's exposure through stories and through support. And you're dealing with highly activated limbic systems through the phone, through the computer, even in your personal encounters on your day-to-day life. And I think we're all aware and willing to admit that there are some pretty significant effects on the workers themselves, on all of us who do this kind of thing. But it's important to have clarity about really that extent and also what we can do with it. These are the structures that I've been talking about a little bit before. I'm just going to give you another snapshot before I move on. I mentioned the limbic system, right? This is the profile of a kiddo here, but the idea here is that, the prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until people are in their 20s. And until then, the limbic system is much more influential over our behavior. So the reason why this matters today is because most adults are also still walking around with slightly activated limbic systems. And the consequence of this is that we tend to engage with each other in a way that isn't as logical, that might not be as thought through, that might be without consideration of some of the consequences that we would do if the limbic system was a little bit more regulated, right? So in an ideal world, we have limbic system and we have prefrontal cortex and everything's integrated in order to help us function the most effective way possible. And when the limbic system is taking over a little bit more in charge, the results tend to not work out very well when it comes to, especially when it comes to academic performance, when it comes to appropriate social things. Yeah, let's see. Oh, I see a good question in the Q&A. I will try to get to that. Thank you. Okay. So stress and trauma, how do they come together? How does this play out in terms of the work? This is what it looks like, right? You have two systems that can respond to either stress or trauma. The first one is your HPA, right? HPA axis is what it's most commonly called. It concerns the release of cortisol. And this is what I call the slow burn. It builds up over time. This is the kind of thing that can give you ulcers. It gives you migraines. It keeps you up at night. And it starts doing that before you kind of even recognize, in many cases, what has been happening, because it's been building up and building up until you have physical effects that go with it. And the interesting thing about cortisol is that it is sort of a Goldilocks stress hormone, right? It's a thing that you need just the right amount of. If you have too little cortisol, you tend to be, you have problems with immune compromise, meaning that you're more likely to get sick. If you have too much cortisol, it can actually make you sick. And to be frank, that's the end of the spectrum that most of us are operating on right now, is too much. The SAM system, on the other hand, is that fast, adrenaline-oriented fight or flight response. That's the system that, gets you moving, gets you out of the way of the bear, and activates very, very quickly. So between the two of these, this is how our bodies are designed to stay safe. When they are activated more than they should, there are pretty serious and can be clear physiological effects around that. So I'm going to pause really quick, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can ask you another question in Mentimeter about specific challenges that you're seeing and particular outcomes. Like when you think about these stress responses and HPA, adrenaline, cortisol building up, what are the challenges and the sort of outcomes that you might be experiencing that are related to that? And I think the Mentimeter is going to pop up for the second one. Yeah, there we go. The Mentimeter is in the chat. A lot of violence. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, we are planning to do some additional training around these topics. So it would be helpful to have here, or when you do your evaluation survey, trying to understand what are the challenges you're facing and what are the training needs, which we'll talk about later, so we can formulate, better responses in the new year.
For those of you who are participating today who aren't specifically doing crisis line response, if you're doing behavioral health support, I guess what I'm curious about is what are some of the challenges that are either personal or related to the job that are sort of those day-to-day encounters and things that are disruptive for you and affecting your behavioral health. So we can get a sense of what the issues are, then we can address them. Limited teams. I'm seeing staffing show up in the chat at least, and I'm seeing that on the Mentimeter as well. Lack of resources, difficulty offering follow-up care in a timely manner, probably in part a result of staffing as well. Yeah. Resources, yeah. There just aren't enough. I ran into that today. I'm trying to find a clinician in my practice that will work with a 14-year-old who's a connection that I know, and we don't have anybody in our practice, and haven't for quite some time, who has openings and working with adolescents and teens. We just don't have anybody, and it's so frustrating to not have resources for these kids that need it. Okay, thanks, Gabrielle. I think I'll go ahead and take back over. Is that okay? Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and people can still add to that while we're going through the next section, but obviously want to pay attention to what you're saying too. But if you didn't get to throw it in, please throw it in wherever you can, because we really like to hear your perspectives.
Yeah, thank you for participating in that for sure. So among the other, sort of common experiences, I do want to recognize the logistics around staffing affect all of these things. But when it comes to what we refer to as really known and common experiences with large scale stress disruption, we're talking about stress eating, can't sleep, substance use, anger outbursts, just sort of this distraction. There's this new thing, it's called revenge bedtime procrastination, where you stay up until 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, surfing the internet. It's Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and all the things. And it's, we're trying so desperately to reclaim part of our time as human beings that we do things that are not intentionally unhealthy, right? So that revenge bedtime procrastination is really, really a common thing. I did not invent that term. I wish I had. I would love to take credit for it, but yeah. Lots of other common things. I just don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. The one that we probably talk about the least, especially for adults, is this brain fog, feeling like you're worried that you're getting ADHD, or that you're worried about early onset dementia because you can't concentrate, you can't focus, you can't think clearly, you can't remember things. If what I'm saying is ringing a bell for you, and there's like, oh yeah, like that seems like that's me too, please understand that when your cortisol levels reach a certain height, right, it's reached a certain amount, that your cognitive functioning is going to be impaired by that. Your stress levels have a direct effect on cognitive processing. So please, and a lot of primary care physicians are less aware, not of the cortisol relationship, but the way that large-scale disasters can impact cognitive functioning. So don't be afraid to bring it up. There's a real reason why that brain fog is so common right now. And it's not just you. For those of you who are working with, well, I mean, this is not just a kid or an adult thing. So it's in general, one of the other sort of common expressions of this level of distress is what we refer to as acting out or acting in. And all that means is external versus internal expression. So people who tend to be actor-outers express their distress externally. That is substance use and aggression and hostility or illegal behavior or recklessness, right? That is a fifth grader who flips over a desk when they miss a spelling test item. We have internal actor-inners. Those are folks who do the opposite, where they might have been, that same fifth grader might be previously engaged in answering questions, and now they are sitting with their head down. They're not participating. They're not answering questions too. So yeah, internal and external expressions of distress, really, really common things. Okay. One of the things that's going on collectively for all of us is this relationship with time. Our sense of time is off. And I don't know, I don't know if some of you are in the same boat as I am, where I'm still some part of my brain thinks Thanksgiving is in a couple months, and it's kind of like September right now. And it's not, but my brain is not caught up with wherever we happen to be. That's what I'm struggling with between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But here's what I know. Our sense of time does not have its own receptors. So our brain processes time by getting input from all of our senses. And when something is intense, meaning typically that it's distressing, that it's painful, that it's overwhelming to us, that perception means that time is perceived as being longer than it actually is. So stronger is perceived as longer. The more intense it is, the longer it seems like it lasts. So we need accurate encoding of all of our senses in order to accurately process time. And I think why I'm mentioning this is that part of our recovery process, and I'm going to talk more about this in a second, but this transition of identifying out of emergency mode and into sort of everyday crisis responding, that seems incredibly impossible. But part of that process is around reprioritizing the time that we have. And I'm going to bring this back up again. But please keep in mind that working with your own personal sense of time and how you use it and what you spend it doing and prioritizing really it's essential to this. Okay. Transitioning to and from emergency mode. This is so hard. And it is the audience, all of you, whether or not you personally are a crisis line responder, but if you do healthcare support during the pandemic, right, you have been in emergency mode for longer than you might care to admit. All of us have. You have also been in some capacity, even if you don't do emergency work, you've been a first responder. I would argue that most elementary school teachers have been first responders at some point during the pandemic. It is really, really a hard transition to make. Your body needs the opportunity to let down on the threat scanning. And I want to acknowledge the comment in the chat that I'm not going to call anyone's name out, but some people can't get their distress levels down low enough to try meditation, do yoga. Sometimes trying it makes it worse. I have so much respect for that. And it is a significant physiological roadblock that's in the way of our working through some of these things. So I do appreciate you making that comment. The addiction to this intensity of crisis responding is a very real thing. We get addicted to the dopamine. We get addicted to the epinephrine, the adrenaline associated with being hyped up all the time. I did also have the opportunity to work with a crisis responder recently who his resting heart rate is significantly higher than normal. And when he is confronted with a real emergency, it actually goes down because that's like the zone that he's good at functioning in. And so it's this sort of weird inverse thing where he's constantly hyped up and ready to go. But then when there's an incident, he's kind of in his calm, good place. And that is a good example of our bodies becoming dependent on circumstances in the environment to keep us going. We have to be mindful of this. One of the recommendations that I want to suggest here is, as a group of people, as a group of professionals, that we make the attempt to engage a new process when we are presented with a new task. So if someone sends you an email and said, hey, I have to have these numbers by close of business today, I need this report right now, it's an emergency, right? Even if it's phrased that way, to sit back, pause, and think critically about if that's actually true. If we can start the ball rolling slowly in a different direction and into this sort of critical thinking evaluation mode, and rather than just diving in and doing it, it's going to facilitate a cultural shift away from being constantly on all the time, which, as you all know, has physical consequences. So slowing down, prioritizing, deciding, does this actually have to happen right now, or can this wait a couple days? And maybe someone else is calling it an emergency, but in fact, it is not an emergency. It is a common thing for veterans. Yeah. Yep. Sorry, I'm commenting about something else in the chat. Your heart rate being lower during emergency response is actually a common thing for some veterans to experience as well. So the benefits of orienting to right now, and this does go back to that other comment that I was mentioning, that, you know, meditation, yoga, mindfulness, these are aspirational in a lot of ways. Here's what I want to recommend today. Anything you can do, anything that you believe you're capable of to get your body to orient to right now. And what I mean by right now is not yesterday or 2 hours ago or next week or tomorrow or dinner, right? But what is actually happening now? It doesn't have to be mindfulness. That definitely does not work for everybody. Meditation doesn't work for me. Guided meditation is kind of iffy because at least I have something I can focus on, but there is not a one size fits all thing. And if you personally have a trauma history, mindfulness and meditation might be very triggering for you. So it's not for everybody, but what is for everybody is some way to focus on the present moment, some way to get your brain in the here and now. Your senses are usually the most effective and easiest way to do that. So anything with your 5 senses, right? Sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound. So it can be just sitting and breathing. It could actually be going for a walk and just taking some deep breaths and soaking it in, hopefully not the pouring rain, right? But being fully immersed in the present current environment that you're part of, for sure. There's lots of resources here. I linked a couple things that provide data if you're curious about it, but these practices, these present-oriented practices are very healthy. This is just an fMRI slide that I want to show you that sort of illustrates visually what happens in the brain when you practice these things on a regular basis. So this is a patient that had very high stress levels and a very active amygdala. So the thing that you're seeing lit up on the screen is the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, right? That's our threat response. And you can see that on the left, on my left at least, it's very yellow. And that means it's very active, has a high metabolic rate. This is the same person after 8 weeks of doing mindful attention for about 10 to 15 minutes a day. Now, you might think I don't have 10 to 15 minutes a day. And that may be true, but I would argue strongly that most of us have 10 to 15 minutes a day that we could give up from doom scrolling on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all the things, right? We could give that up. We could trade it out to try this present-oriented thinking to see if you can change your brain. And what's cool is that it's not just this one MRI and this one study. This has been replicated a lot, and we know that you can actually structurally change the way that neurons connect by practicing this stuff for about 10 minutes a day. That's not an investment that everybody's willing to make. That's fine. I'm done selling it now. But if you're willing to give it a try, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the opportunity here. And again, it does not have to be meditation or anything specific. There's lots of different options. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about the impacts of the work. I'm going to talk about PTSD and some of the risk factors associated with that, and also then transition into what we know is helpful here. So stress at the level of disorder, right? All of us, every single person has experienced some fairly significant degree of stress over the last few years. To qualify for a clinical diagnosis, typically, requires a set of circumstances that kind of come together at the right or the wrong, depending on how you want to conceptualize it, time, right? So it's typically the result of a predisposition or a set of risk factors based on childhood experiences, and then a triggering event, an incident, or a series of events, right? It's not a particular recipe, but it's often a combination. The diagnostic features of PTSD are fairly straightforward. It's the experience of an event, a stressor, an actual threatened death or physical injury, witnessing or learning of the same. And I'll get to this in a minute, but there is so much more exposure in the work that crisis response does. Again, whether it's on the phone or in person or over a camera, it doesn't matter. Lots of exposure that puts people at risk in these ways. There are clusters of symptoms that's sort of a checklist. So an intrusion symptom, more than one, an avoidance symptom where you avoid people or places or things associated with a traumatic event, change in mood or cognition where you have that brain fog or you feel like you can't regulate your emotion response very well. Arousal and reactivity is when you find yourself hypervigilant and really sort of that exaggerated startle response, just as an example of a couple. And then the bottom line here is that even if all of those things I said are resonating with you to some degree, they need to cause clinically significant distress or impairment. So it's a combination of not only having the symptoms, but that the symptoms are getting in the way. And I don't know about all of you, those of you who are diagnosticians or providers, but as a clinician, I feel strongly that we have a problem with diagnosis, and you don't want to label something as being pathological when actually it is an incredibly normal response. And distress right now is normative. So distress is not enough, right? And we need to be very careful about not pathologizing or labeling things that are not. Things that influence PTSD, lots of factors. Sociocultural factors include the severity and proximity and duration of the trauma. Those are typically thought of as like a trauma bullseye. So the closer you are to the middle of the event, and the example that I usually use when I talk about this is 9/11. So if you were in Manhattan on 9/11, you're pretty close to the bullseye. And at some point, when you work your way out through the concentric circles, everyone in the United States at that day on that can identify on some level with what happened, even if you weren't directly involved, right? So think about proximity. That's a risk factor. Social support is a protective factor, right? I don't need to read the rest of these to you, maybe. Psychological factors. The one that I find to be the most relevant is what we call shattering assumptions. And what that means is, let me just give you a personal example. I've done a lot of support in schools over violence and gun violence specifically. And I've worked in a lot of countries with really, really limited resources, a lot of work in Haiti after the earthquake. And one of the things that I thought was very surprising, I wasn't expecting at the time, was the degree of PTSD sort of oriented risk when people are coming from an environment where their assumptions about their safety and what happens here and what doesn't happen here has been shattered. There's this thing in disaster science called the belief in a just world theory. And that theory is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And we know that that's not true, right? We all know that this isn't true. However, if your lived experience has reinforced this belief in a just world theory subconsciously, right? When something bad happens, because inevitably bad things happen, it rocks your world. And it's a big risk for PTSD because you don't know where to put it in your experience. It hasn't been part of what you've lived through. On the other hand, if you have experienced challenges, you've experienced adversity, you have lived through some stuff, right? That actually is protective. So mild to moderate exposures over time are protective against PTSD. Physiological hyperactivity can be a little bit of a risk factor. So that's an example of that is a car engine that's already revving a little high. It doesn't take much to rev it a little too high to get it into an unsafe place. Genetics can be for or against people, as can age. Age can be protective to the extent that if you've lived through some stuff, you can remind yourself, I've been through it. I did okay. I survived. I can do it again. For young kids, age can be protective depending on the extent that adults can shield them from what's happening. But You don't want to lie to kids. You don't want to be dishonest about things. You just don't want to overwhelm them with something that's not developmentally appropriate, right? So you need to be honest and you need to be straightforward with kids, but not overwhelming to the extent that you can. I mean, that's not always possible. Okay. I just want to mention a couple things here. The links to the resources are on the bottom there, but PTSD is present in approximately 15% of emergency response personnel, 13% of rescue teams, 7% of firefighters, and 5% of police. This is the bottom line over here. More than 80% of first responders experience traumatic events on the job. So that exposure is a risk factor in and of itself, and it's what we do with it that's going to matter, to help each other and to support continuing doing crisis work in any kind of a way. And here's what we know works. So let's get to that. That's the good stuff. Ooh, Jess, I feel like that's a good comment. Good Will Hunting, great movie. I haven't used my Die Hard example, but I can bring that up later. Die Hard has a great example in it of a classic sort of parasympathetic nervous system response. So I'll bring that up in a second. But Jess is putting in the chat an example from Good Will Hunting. Shock PTSD is what happens when you believe that the world is safe and suddenly realize that it's not. Yeah, that's the shattering of assumptions that I was just talking about. Okay. So when I was in graduate school, I was complaining to one of my supervisors, which, not always the best idea, that I didn't have enough time to finish all the things that I was supposed to do. And he looked at me and he paused and he said, "But you have all the time that there is." And I did not respond well to that. I was pretty annoyed, but he wasn't wrong. And it stuck with me, right? Every single person has 24 hours and there's no magic bucket of time that some people have access to that others don't. So it really is about empowerment for how you use what you've got. And if you haven't thought about this before, I would recommend drawing a circle on a piece of paper, like a pie, and writing out for yourself, how much of your pie is spent doing various activities, sleeping, working, home time, family time, personal time, like however you want to categorize it, and looking at it visually so that it becomes more clear what your options might be for adjusting those boundaries a little bit. Because when you actually sit down and think about it, you might have time that you can give up or shift in a different place to allow yourself to do something that's a little healthier. The one thing I don't want you to walk away from this webinar thinking is, oh, great, now I've got a whole bunch more stuff to do, right? That's not it at all. I know how tired everybody is. I'm very, very clear. I did a webinar earlier this morning and with a mentee, and the number one response was, how are you feeling today? Overwhelmed. Overwhelmed, overwhelmed, overwhelmed. There is not a lot of excess in anything, right? Resources, attention. And so it's not about finding more. It's about using what you've got in a more effective way. And so things that I'd like you to consider are boundaries, healthier boundaries that we can support each other. Everyone who does this work, like let's figure out how to say no, because that's okay. And in fact, it needs to happen. It's not just okay, it needs to happen. We can't always pick up all the slack all the time, because if everybody ends up completely burning out, there will be no one left to do the work. And you can't pour tea out of an empty teapot. Leave it at that, right? Think, this is rhetorical, right? But think to yourself, what would be different if your colleagues could see you handle pressure in a healthier way? What would it look like? I think it has incredible potential to change the culture around some of this stuff and to increase behavioral health support, to change how it feels to be at work. If we engage with our boundaries and with each other in a slightly different way. Two variables that predict the capacity to manage pressure is the sense of purpose that you bring and the sense of potential. And the potential is really what shows up when you don't have the staff and you don't have the budget. It's like, well, okay, all these roadblocks keep getting thrown up. What are my options? How can I problem solve? What's the best strategy to apply here? That is a prefrontal cortex response and not a limbic system response. Psychological moderators of stress. There are a few. I'm just going to talk about a couple before we wrap up. So explanatory style is one, locus of control is one, psychological hardiness and or resilience is sort of a third. All of these things can contribute to how you sort of process stress in your day-to-day. So the first one is explanatory style. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go online and you can Google around for like a quiz in this area. Be warned, there are a ton of links that will lead you to clickbait, not validated quizzes around this stuff. So be careful with that. But if you're curious about your own and you can't just figure it out by looking at this list, there are a lot of quizzes you can take. People who are optimistic have a very flip-flopped view of how you explain what's happened, right? So if you're optimistic and you're successful, then that's because you did a good job or you are good at your work. And that's how it is in general. If you have a pessimistic style and you are successful, that's because the teacher made the test easy, that client was easy to handle. It's only this one time. And it's not how it is. It was just luck, right? And it flip-flops. So look at the items, ignore the pessimistic one a little bit and focus on that explanatory style that's optimistic, and consider how you could work on shifting your explanation in your head about the successes that you do have or the failures that you encounter, right? And how you can sort of reorient your personal explanations for how those things play out. What you do with that in your own mind has a huge impact on how the rest of your day goes, as you can imagine, right? Because if you're walking around with an optimistic explanatory style, it'll give you a lot more sort of motivation to move forward with the next challenge, for sure. Locus of control is the next one. Locus of control is a belief about whether or not the outcomes of your actions are based on what you do versus fate and left up to things that are outside of your control. We used to think that internal locus of control was healthier. That has changed over the last 10 or 15 years. It is now more of a bimodal. Remember the graph from acting out and acting in? There is a time and a place when, take the test during the webinar. Oh, yeah. Sorry. There's a time when having an external locus of control where you just give up, right? You just say, it's not up to me. I got to step back and someone else is in charge of what happens here. That's actually not a bad thing. There are specific circumstances when that's okay. Internal locus of control, on the other hand, is very healthy when you are recovering from surgery or you have an accident and you're like, you know what? I'm going to get better. I'm going to make myself get better. And I can be in charge of that outcome. I do encourage you to consider taking this quiz. This is one that I've looked at, and you have to be careful what you click on because there's some misleading things there too, but there's a start button on the bottom. If you could wait until after we're done, that would be helpful too, so it doesn't distract you. The last thing here is psychological hardiness. And this might ring a bell with resilience. Commitment, a sense of devotion, a sense of connection, AKA resilience, right? Sense of control, which is mastery over activities. That also is kind of like purpose, right? And then challenge, a perception of life events as challenging and not threatening. And that's adaptability. So there's a lot of overlap with psychological hardiness and resilience. Surprise, surprise. Here's the resilience tree. So your purpose is your fruit of the tree, right? It's what you're doing, what you're producing, what you're growing. Please, if you haven't thought about this in a while, try to sit down and orient yourself around why it is you're doing the work that you're doing. And really get to the root of it, not just the superficial reasons, but why is the work meaningful to you? And what are the options for adjusting it and changing it and enhancing your sense of purpose if it doesn't feel very motivational to you? Connection are the roots. Those are your people. That's your colleagues that get it. That's your friends, your family members who get it and understand. That's a faith community or people who have the same hobbies that you do or like the same things on Instagram or whatever it is, right? So dealing with connection when it's been threatened over the last couple of years, we need to reconnect with each other. Adaptability is the trunk of the tree that sways in the storm. And that's the hardest one. People do not like to adapt. We like things to be predictable. We like to know what's coming, and adaptability is the hardest one to develop. It also tends to be the first one to go when we feel threatened. So when we experience a crisis, if you haven't practiced this, right, and you feel really scared by the crisis, you might sort of double down on what it is that you already know and stick to that because it's known. And when things are in crisis and they feel chaotic, it's too overwhelming to think of options, right? That's that limbic oriented protect and defend response. To practice adaptability, you want to try and slow down your response and try and engage the prefrontal cortex and think about, okay, what are my options here that feel like they're reasonable to me that I can move forward with? It's just tricky, but it's a process that folks can learn. Yeah. And then hope is the moss that grows on the north side of the tree. Hope is something that thrives in disasters, but it's usually not what we're paying attention to. So, moss in Washington, at least, it likes it on the north side of the tree where it's dark and cold and doesn't have a lot of light. Hope also does just fine in disasters, but we're just so busy with putting out fires that we don't pay attention. So hope is realistic opportunity. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. It's based on realistic opportunity. And interestingly, hope is the only one of these 4 ingredients that is really influenced by cultural experience. So for people who have experienced racism and marginalization and problems with access to resources, their lived experience has shown them that hope is harder to come by because it's based on realistic opportunity. So all 4 of these things can be developed, but please do keep in mind that access to hope is going to feel different for different people based on that experience. Okay. Active listening is something else that we know works in the same category. Please be willing to listen to each other. I'm guessing that one of the last things that most of you want to do, if you've been listening to people all day and supporting them, and I know I put myself in this category sometimes, when you go home, you don't want to listen. You might not want to listen to your kids or your partner. You might just want to sit and recharge and recover. There's nothing wrong with that, but I do encourage you to be clear about what you need and why and for how long, right? So if you walk in the door, you don't want people to dump on you. Work something out so that there's a system in place that can give you either your drive home or 5 minutes where you can change your clothes or do whatever it is that you need to do to set up a system that facilitates the break so that you're not always listening and always taking things in all the time. When you do have the capacity to engage in active listening, not in a professional setting, of course in a professional setting, but in addition to that, we know that it's helpful in terms of behavioral health support, right? I'm probably just preaching to the choir on this one, so. Okay. Boundaries. I've mentioned this so many times. Boundaries are not optional for health, for mental health, emotional support, and health. We need to protect our time off. American work culture, Gabrielle has probably heard this joke so many times, but there was a meme that went around last summer that said, an out-of-office reply in Europe says, I'm backpacking for the summer, I'll catch you in September. And an out-of-office reply in the United States says, I'm having kidney surgery on my lunch break, but you can still reach me on my cell phone. And that one hits a little different, right? It's funny, but it's like, oh gosh, like, yeah, we have a problem with that, right? And I find that some of the best memes do that, right? It's funny, but it's also kind of cringeworthy because it's touching on something that's a real issue for people. We need to transition away from on and less on to on call, and off. Okay, I'm going to invite you all to add in the chat. What are some things, we went through what we know works. What are some other things that can support you in the work that you do? Some training needs or other types of supports that would help you with the work that you do. If you could go ahead and, we're not going to skip to the Mentimeter just as a function of time, but if you could go ahead and add that into the chat, I'll pause for a minute and invite people to ask.
Thanks, Kira. Yeah. And as I said, we are trying to collect, this kind of information around what could we do at the MHTTC and with our colleagues and partners like yourself to plan for training needs, supports that we can talk to agencies about or work with those of you doing crisis line work out in the community, especially in Region 10. But hearing anybody's perspective is really helpful. And, you talked about all the different levels that people experience things, and we may only be able to address some of those things, but it would be great to just hear whatever thoughts people have. So thank you for making some space for that. And that includes, I personally don't know, how is the training when people get hired? How is onboarding? How is, what are you taught around these issues, right? Of having boundaries and resilience and taking a break and all of that. I don't really have any sense of what that's like for all of you. What is supervision like? What are the shifts like? Are you having to work a lot of extra hours? Is it just workforce shortages? What can teams do? And like what you talked about, what can agencies do and changing the culture around to keep people going? You can't burn the candle at both ends, as you say. So, so thank you for all your thoughts. We really appreciate hearing and want to work this into some sort of plan for the new year if we can.
Thanks, folks. Appreciate your contributions in the chat there. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to share with you one last model, and then I'm going to talk about a very concrete action plan for like a coping plan that we know is effective. So this is about thriving. This is not, I want to be exceptionally clear here. This is not going to give you more work to do. This is not to do extra stuff. This is not to add more to your plate. This is about concepts to keep in mind as you move forward in the work and in life, right? Things to emphasize with the work that you're doing and the interactions that you have. So these are all content areas. It's not process, it's content areas, but things to focus on that are based on disaster recovery and clinical research correlated with positive outcomes for people. So number one is transparency. Modeling the behavior that you want to see increased in your workplace. Don't just talk about it, do it. Have a signature line on your email that says, I'm sending this email at a time that works for me. I do not expect a reply outside of your own working hours. Respecting people's vacation time, not sending 30,000 messages, sort of waiting until they get back, and everybody kind of agreeing implicitly or explicitly that we're all going to get on that same page and support each other's ability to take some time off. There is nothing that prevents a good vacation/rest break more than knowing that what gets back, when you get back, what awaits you is worse than when you left. That is one of the work culture things that we have to change. And part of that is something all of us can contribute to, is holding off and waiting until someone gets back and then slowly sending things on to them, like you hanging on to it when you're on shift, right? And sending it to them when they're back, rather than letting 500 things pile up on somebody. Because when you leave, you would like the same courtesy extended to you, to not run into that when you get back. That's a big change, but that's important. And then sharing not so good news too, right? Sharing when you don't know something, for those of you who are in leadership positions, be willing to say, hey, I don't know. It could be option A, B, C. We're not sure here, for sure. The H in Thrive stands for healthy engagement. Healthy engagement in crisis work is not possible without good boundaries. So it all goes hand in glove. You can only engage in a healthy way when you have the capacity emotionally and physically to be able to invest in some of the work that you're doing, not just sort of show up, right? And when your burnout might be at a level where all you can do is just show up, that is the big red flag warning sign that there needs to be some sort of attention or focus given to your restorative time. Whether that's starting with just evaluating your 24 hours, whether that's putting your phone down and not doing so much revenge bedtime procrastination. Maybe that's not, whatever the unhealthy things are, just cutting back on some of that stuff a little bit to give you that restorative time so that you can engage in a healthy way at work. The R in Thrive is about respect for people. And that means all kinds of people. That means what a cool opportunity we have here to bring voices to the table that have been excluded before, to think of new ideas about how to do things, to tackle this work in a different way, and in a way that sort of might prioritize different kinds of things. We have to fix some stuff here. It's not an option. And so we can't usually fix things by doing the same things from the same voices and the same perspectives that we've always had. So let's take advantage of the fact that we need to do this and really say, hey, what are the opportunities here to learn from other lived experiences and from voices that we typically don't include, whether those are at the planning tables or discussions or in group meetings, that kind of thing. So thrive with a focus on integration. Integration is in 3 levels. Number 1 is amongst people within your team. When you show up at work, are you working as part of a team to achieve a goal, or are you on your own in an isolated way? Working on developing team cohesion. That's kind of another talk, but it's important. Number 2 is integrating your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And the more on the same page you can get with acting in a way that's consistent with how you think and feel, is going to be better suited for you, right? We know that a lot of anxiety and depression comes from when people's thoughts are over here, but how they're feeling and then how they're acting are very, very different from that. So get them kind of together. And then the 3rd level of integration is the most detailed, and that is integration between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. Getting those pieces of the brain to work in concert with each other, the way it's designed to help you function effectively. The V in Thrive is a little bit of another talk too, but if you've never done it, try to consider engaging in a core values identification exercise. If you can engage your core values, it will help you navigate really, really difficult meetings, conversations, encounters with people, because the way that you approach it, the way that you approach those challenging encounters is grounded in, I know I want to be this type of person. And so I'm going to act and I'm going to respond and I'm going to listen and I'm going to behave in a way towards that other person that's consistent with this value. Just to give you an example of this, I have a 4-NATO at home. I don't know how many of you have kids. So I have a 4-year-old who is quite something. And I love him greatly, but he is a challenge, and patience is one of my core values. So I want to be a more patient person, but it's hard. It's really hard for me. And he gives me opportunities to practice being patient on a regular basis. And so when I engage with him, I can respond shortly, I can get frustrated, or I can remind myself, I want to work on my patience. That's important to me. And that's going to make me choose a different way of engaging with him, for sure. The E in Thrive is about effort. Spend some time in staff meetings calling out and acknowledging effort, acknowledging the work that's being done and how hard it's been for people. Ask your colleagues how they prefer to be appreciated. Think about like the 5 love languages, but in a workplace way, right? Acts of bagel, that kind of thing. Like what is a way that someone wants to be called out or appreciated? Because not everybody likes to see their name in an email. And so expressing appreciation and effort in a way that lands. And then finally, some of you had asked about this when you were listing things that would be helpful. This is just a very sort of a high level example of it, but if you don't have one already, please consider making a solid coping plan. A good coping plan. You might be surprised to hear this. I have a color-coded Excel spreadsheet. That is not for everybody. You could put a sticky note on your refrigerator. It does not matter what it looks like. But the point is that your coping plan needs to include a list of what you know works for you, right? So don't put anything on there that doesn't work for you. No yoga or journaling if those aren't your things. Put only things that work for you and different time frames. Those are really, really key things. If everything on your coping plan takes an hour to do, you're never going to get it done. Right? You're never going to pick something because it's all an hour. Things on your coping plan need to take between 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and also things you can do at work as well as at home or on your weekends or evenings. So lots of different options. Sensory stuff to get you back to the present moment. Something that you feel like petting the dog. That's a good one. Going for a walk, whatever. Lots of options. Look what's possible. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to spend a few minutes. I know I'm short on time. I'm going to address some of the Q&A.
Oh, great.
Excuse me. Okay. I think I'm going to run to the answered questions because I think there were a few that when you responded, they got into the answered category. Roger asked about the research around 5th graders to 7th. Well, so you were asking about what does the data show with kids that are behind, that have skipped that in-person transition. I don't know. I don't know what the data say. I am getting that comment from my discussions that I've had with 2 hospital supervisors. These are directors of behavioral health hospitals that have both noted separately the same pattern, where the kids that are being hospitalized for inpatient acute mental health needs have missed that in-person transition. So that's anecdotal. It's also another piece of contribution to that comment was some of the clients that I work with. These are parents who have kids that have missed it, and they're saying personally to me, my 8th grader is just lost because last time they turned around, they were in 5th grade, and now they don't know how to be an 8th grader. So that's where that's coming from. I'm hoping there is some research on it soon because I think there's something there, but my comments were anecdotal in that way. Yeah. Other comments. Madison asks, how do you feel about the idea that your mental health condition itself can be traumatic, and how does that affect those that are crisis workers? Are we more susceptible to secondhand trauma? Madison, part of the answer to this question is one that I know all of us are familiar with in psychology, which is it all depends. A mental health condition, in fact, is not inherently a risk factor. It depends on what it is, and it depends on the coping skills and the resources that have been brought to bear. My experience during the pandemic, working with a lot of different people with lots of different kinds of things, has been that if you have had something that you've been working with and kind of managing along in the context of before the pandemic, you might have a coping plan already. You might have resources and you're like, what to do because you've been through it, right? So that's actually it can be a little bit of a protective factor. Now, the other side of the coin is that it absolutely can be a higher risk factor in some cases. So it's not a one size fits all thing. I would encourage you to sort of leverage the experience that you might have with what works and what doesn't work. And be really aware of the risk factors when it comes to that secondhand trauma, because that is a risk for everyone. Everyone who does crisis response work is at risk for secondary trauma. And so just to have that willingness to evaluate how you feel like you're really doing and being honest. If you notice that you're consuming more alcohol, or you're avoiding friends, or you're withdrawing in some kind of a way, or at this time of year, add to cart, like engaging in unhealthy behaviors that increase some neurotransmitters, but not in a healthy way. Just that's the opportunity to do something different, right? I hope that answers your question. And then Juliet, could you touch on how an individual's flexibility seems to change as they age? That also can go either way. So one of the things that happens with moderate exposure to adversity as you get older is that it's reassuring. You think, I've done this, I've lived through things, I know what to do when this happens again, and you kind of just handle it. The other side of the coin, for people who either have not experienced much adversity or who have been completely overwhelmed by it, it can break them down. And so again, with the bell curve, it's dangerous if it's on the one extreme end or the other extreme end when it comes to trauma exposure and age. It's not a risk factor for everybody, nor is it protective. So it's both. I think that's it in terms of the Q&A. It looks like there are some more things in the chat, but I don't know if there are questions.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. We want to just share, there are some other things coming up. We are going to have in a week, different time, but when is the crisis really over for first responders and teams? So I will put this in the chat. Let's see if I can do that. Here we go. And then we have some other events coming up. I just wanted to share, that is not it. Here we go. See if that works. So we'd love to get your feedback, but also, so we have a wonderful clinician, Sharonda Jamerson from Harborview, and talking about race and racism and talking about those things in therapeutic conversations, not coming undone. Do you see me? Moving from intolerance to acceptance. And then related to some of this work as well is an event on 988 in Washington State, but we hope some of these lessons and journeys, both from the legislative side and also there's a Native and Strong Crisis Lifeline as well that we want to talk about first in the nation. So I want to thank you for your time. We're right at time. Thank you, Kira, so much for your time as always. I think people could spend a year and still keep asking for more, but we really appreciate your time. And thank you to everybody who made time out of your busy day today to chat and share your thoughts and input so we can take this forward into the future. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks.